Welcome. Thank you, all of you, for joining us on this slightly gloomy, but otherwise quite lovely London late afternoon. And it's also such a pleasure to welcome those of you who are joining online. Apologies for the late start. You would think that this kind of late into the pandemic experience, we would be very good with this technology, but we still do have some stumbles. My name is Anne Pollock, and I'm the head of Department of Global Health and Social Medicine, and it's really a pleasure to welcome all of you to this Age of Health event. The Age of Health is a series that started during the pandemic, where the School of Global Affairs was working with the Department of Global Health and Social Medicine to really speak to how questions of health and medicine are central to social, political, and cultural questions of our age. And this event, I think, is, it's been less active, I think, the Age of Health series since we've kind of moved back to more in-person events and more different kinds of events. And I think that this event really speaks to the ongoing value of the Age of Health, right? Really thinking through. So in this case, the questions about the notion of challenging progress and thinking about both the life course and the geopolitics of development are things that social scientists of health and medicine are uniquely well positioned to help to provide us all with insights into. And so I will hand over to Dominique, who is your host for today. I just want to extend a very warm welcome on behalf of the department.
Thank you for being going to be sharing some mics. So thank you all for coming. At the onset, my name is Dominique, and I'm based at the Department of Global Health and Social Medicine. We will be recording, so just to let everyone online, as you already know, and a drinks reception will follow for those of us who are here. So I don't want to belabor a formal introduction of our guests. They'll be speaking shortly, and on the link for the event, you'll find their web pages with information on the many exciting projects that they're doing. But I did want to take about 3 or 4 minutes to share some thoughts about how their work really has inspired me to think about why it would be a useful exercise to bring us together in a roundtable format. So working in different parts of the world on quite distinct empirical subjects and using often different but also overlapping theoretical approaches, each critically interrogates key concepts such as development, progress, growth, normal, abnormal, concepts that are central to the organization of modern industrial society and enduring forms of coloniality. But they do so in a way that does not simply diagnose or critique. Queer theorist Eve Sedgwick famously argued against dominant traditions in the social sciences that stop at the moment of critique. Cultural critic Ramzi Fawaz writes that Sedgwick believed that we lack not more or better theories, but the ethical, affective, and political orientations required to make theories have a palpable, transformative effect in our everyday lives. And literary critic and cultural theorist Lauren Berlin, also inspired by Sedgwick, eloquently summarized this position when she urged scholars to shift from a politics of denouncement to one saturated by the ethical pressures to figure out repair in the face of intensifying world disrepair. So in my reading, our panelists guests today write in a way that holds us researchers, us members of the community, accountable for the way we do our research, for the afterlife of our concepts, and for rising to this challenge of trying to remedy problems in our world. So Navtej Perwal, professor of political sociology and development studies at SOAS, has wonderful work, in my view, the nugget that I chose to highlight, to really think about what it means to have a truly intersectional and ethical feminist politics that does not collide with histories of coloniality, and is doing amazing work bringing also together artists together with scholars. Martin Savransky, reader and director of the Center for Critical Global Change at Global Smiths, also inspires by bringing together decolonial theory, anthropology, and philosophy to explore the specific contingent contextual qualities of what it would mean to make the pluriverse remain with us. Michelle Pentecost, senior lecturer in anthropology and global health and a UKRI Future Leaders Fellow, has just written a book just out on the politics of potential in South Africa, which explores the rise of developmental origins of health and disease, a whole body of research influencing policy. And what I find particularly interesting in her work is how she's always calling to attention to other politics of potential, not only the ones dictated by global health, ones that are already at play in the ground. And Francisco Ortega, professor in the Catalan Institute of Research and Advanced Studies in Tarragona, Spain, and also a visiting professor here in the department, has worked on a range of topics, neurodiversity, pandemic solidarity, that are also woven with this deep concern of how reparative approaches can undo the core medical and cultural dichotomies that reproduce hierarchies of power. So without further ado, I want to thank our guests for rising to the challenge of thinking in terms of a roundtable and cross-disciplinary and cross-topic discussion. We have about 3 questions to work through, and each speaker will take that question in turn, and then we'll have ample time to open up to our guests for questions from the audience. So with the first question, we wanted to ask, how does your work engage with and challenge core concepts such as human development, social development, progress, normal, abnormal, in the social and or biological sciences? So we'll just begin with that and hear a bit more about how each one approaches this. And we could just take it this way, this round, and then we'll go back the other way.
Thanks so much, Dominique, for that lovely introduction. Is everyone okay with the sound? Okay.
I have something on that. Is there no way we can? It is quite confusing.
It's an echo.
There's an echo.
I think it's not an echo, but that we can hear you directly and then also from the loudspeaker. So if this is primarily for Zoom,
It's
just
primarily for recording too, so that's the only difficult.
Maybe because the two
Can you
microphones
turn it
are on.
off one maybe?
how indeed. It is on mute now.
Oh.
Yeah, it's on mute. Anyway, sorry.
Is there a way of?
Because it's an echo. Did you hear the echo when Dominique was speaking? We were hearing.
Maybe it's just us here.
Is this the mic?
Can we turn it down a little bit?
But maybe it works. Try. Go ahead.
Okay.
Sorry about that.
As long as you can all hear us very well in the audience, and on Zoom, we will be fine. So Dominique has asked us how our work engages with the concepts of human development, social progress, and the normal or abnormal. So I'm trained in both medicine. Yeah. I'm trained in both medicine and anthropology. And my work as an anthropologist has, sorry about these technical difficulties. Okay, so my work as an anthropologist has largely been concerned with studying the logics and assumptions around concepts such as human development and the normal and or pathological in relation to early life health interventions. And that encompasses a range of points across the life course, but is often predominantly focused on maternal health, child health, and more recently, it turns to focus on interventions in what is called the preconception period. So all people of reproductive age, as well as interest on mental health in the perinatal period and in infancy. So my work is focused on global policy that focuses on nutrition and maternal and child health. As part of my Future Leaders Fellowship, I work with the Healthy Life Trajectories Initiative, which is a 4-country study, China, Canada, India, and South Africa, led by the WHO. And this is a study that is looking at complex behavior change intervention in 4 phases: preconception, pregnancy, early infancy, and early childhood, with a view to seeing if this has an effect on childhood obesity rates and early childhood development outcomes. So as you can tell, a unique and complicated topic. And my role working with this trial is number 1 as part of ethnographer, following very interesting scientific story of how to study this topic. And then secondly, I've researched that's qualitative work with the South African of this trial. So my work is really concerned with if, when, and how, with whom such kinds of interventions should take place. So human development as a concept and where and how it might be shaped or influenced by public health attention is, in my research, a fungible and expansive concept. And early life as a category, in my estimation, is really expanding as a period for intervention. And with that, the boundaries of the normal and the pathological, with new baselines for how we understand normality. So in the late 20th century, we know from a wonderful and extensive literature that genetics was really a prominent lens for how we thought about human development. And Nick Rose, who founded our department, was of course a very prominent voice in that literature. And in the 21st century, we've moved to thinking with epigenetics, thinking about how nurture demonstrably interacts with nature to shape human development. So normality now is about how can we design quote unquote optimal environments for human development with all of the attendant opportunities that we can observe for capital to make of that notion of the optimal environment, which is often confined to the maternal body or maternal diet, for example. And we can see this interest from capital, for example, in the commercialized, personalized wellness sector, I'm sure you're all familiar with. The concept of social progress also permeates my work. The global health investments in maternal and child health is shot through with economic, humanitarian, and anticipatory logics that focuses on a distant future of realized potential. And I discuss this in my recently published book, The Politics of Potential, Global Health and Gender Futures in South Africa. And one of the elements of a politics of potential that I describe in that book is that the substance of potential for global health is considered to be in some people and places and not in others. So looking at nutrition interventions to improve maternal and child health for the sake of healthy futures, there is a repetition of colonial and development era logics of who is in need of intervention, the mother-child dyad in the so-called transitioning society. I'll leave that there as my entry point into this conversation. Thank you.
Okay, so my work in this area, I work on a number of different areas, to be honest. I'm kind of a regional specialist and I work on the South Asian region predominantly. But my work, which I think stems into global public health and reproductive rights and reproductive justice, is in many ways kind of a personal journey, which then has segued into my academic journey. And I think it's kind of all joined up together. So some previous work I've done on son preference and sex-selective abortion has in many ways evolved through my understandings of the political context in which reproductive justice, reproductive rights are increasingly being framed. My current work has been kind of going in the direction of having been beginning with looking at India and then comparative work with China on the sex ratio and looking at masculine trends in the sex ratio, which is, of course, been worked on extensively by demographers, and also in the area of social medicine, looking at it through the lens of kind of gender studies, feminist critique, and also looking at it in terms of the coloniality of gender, I think sharpens our analysis. I was involved in a campaign in the UK in 2015, which takes us straight from South Asia, right here, right around the corner, to be honest, from here, where we were suddenly caught in the middle of really a debate, well, within the Houses of Parliament to alter abortion policy from 1967, to amend it on the basis of Indian-born women showing of higher parity births, showing a propensity, which of course later on was not evidenced, towards sex-selective behavior. And on the basis of that, and I think that was where my understanding increasingly of the criminalization of sex-selective abortion became formed. So this work on sex-selective abortion, therefore, isn't about women's rights. It's not about reproductive rights, or even necessarily around safe access to reproductive services. Of course, it is about that. But my work really is around understanding the political context in which feminist mobilizations around access to reproductive services is now being framed. And I think it's the overlapping and intersecting, and how, when I say this, it sounds so complex, it's not. It's how does it align with, how do feminists, how have they, in demanding for criminalization around gender-based violence, and in its various forms. So in the 2015 example I gave you, we found that feminists were mobilizing in line with, at that point, there was an all-party working group identifying ethnicity and its connections to sex-selective behavior within a very anti-migration discourse being framed and put at the center of reproductive, the debates around abortion access. And so my work really is, I'm really interested now in carceral futures of reproductive rights and reproductive justice. If feminists have been mobilizing for access, safe access, and the right to choice, what does it mean then to be envisaging a feminist politics, which can only really myopically understand it in terms of access to reproductive rights without understanding race, without understanding context of the neoliberal context that we see what's happening in this country in terms of the NHS. We also see it in terms of necropolitical power. This goes way beyond when you begin to have carceral futures. And in 2015, it was about criminalizing. It was not about denying access. It was actually about criminalizing sex-selective abortion in this country. And there were sting operations, the media were involved. And at that point, you could see that the UK was very much part of that. I take us to other parts of the world, we can see what does that mean when the use of social and political power is not just about saying that some women are allowed to have access to reproductive services, and some are not. Some pathological cultural norms, and by saying that, we might say that that also frames in other contexts which women are allowed to have the choices, which societies are viewed as being pathological, which societies are allowed to be seen to be deserving of health services, or even the right to life, in not in the sense of that movement of the kind of so-called pro-life and anti-abortion debate, but actually in the necropolitical view. So we see what's happening in Gaza at the moment. 15,000 children up from between October and now have died, and those are just estimates. We can see in the Indian context, take me back to the origins of my research, where we see population policy is constantly, this isn't just about population control or the access to abortion. We see the shaping, the framing of this, largely targeting minority populations. And I think the importance of feminists, the mobilizations for feminists to understand reproductive rights must constantly be connected to and tied to and linked to and recognizing of the ways in which the broader politics are framing the kinds of politics that we're shaping, the kind of carceral futures that we're really in the present.
Thank you. Yeah, so as Dominique mentioned, I work across philosophy, social theory, the environmental humanities, and decolonial studies, and much of my work of late has been concerned with the question that really ought not to be asked, which is the question of what it might take to make lives worth living after progress, outside the coordinates that have inscribed the value of progress at the heart of the modern world. Just another way of saying that I've been grappling with the challenge that on an earth that has been rendered forever unstable and unsafe, the idea of progress has become one we cannot live with, but also one we do not seem to know how to live without. And yet it is merely 200 years old. That commanding idea, that idea which promised a boundless moral, social, technical, economic ascent, guided by reason and technology, towards an open-ended by ever better future. Animated as much by the extractive activities of Europe's various imperial and colonial outposts as by the scientific, industrial, and political revolutions that transformed Europe and much of the world in the 18th century, progress became the guiding modern philosophy of history ever since, inaugurating a new experience of time that claimed to break with the eschatological temporality of previous absolutist forms of government and engendered instead a new universal historicity, which made it possible to attribute to history the latent power of human events and suffering, a kind of power that connected and motivated everything in accordance with a plan to which one could feel responsible, or in whose name one could believe oneself to be acting. Progress, in other words, opened up the future. It made it, in a way, ours. A time of possibility and aspiration, of hope and redemption, of affluence and justice to come, and the sense of a better world that was possible. For the past 3 centuries, we have been singing its praises, extolling its virtues, and anticipating the rhythms of this future to come. We have been thinking, acting, roaming, and plowing the earth in the name of an unknown, yet guaranteed, uncertain, yet hopeful, horizon of futurity which promised to redeem the horrors of the past and to deliver us from the squalor of the present. We woke up yearning for its arrival, and at night, the future became our consolation, our lullaby. Now, from my perspective, since probably the 19th century, the idea of progress becomes not just a value among others, but more importantly, the very perspective of valuation from which other key modern values are derived. Values such as economic growth, civilization, human development, moral betterment, industrialization, human rights, technological innovation, and so on. And yet, as the French poet Paul Valéry might say, the trouble with our times is that the future is not what it used to be. To think the future today is to do so at a time when the socio-ecological disaster that modernity constitutes has not quite precipitated the end of progress, alas, but has, as it were, melted the ice which supported it. As such, it has in some ways turned the future into a potential form of cruelty. As Berlin might say, simultaneously binding the present to fantasies of environmental and moral progress whose colonial and extractive foundations block the very satisfactions they offer, and binding the imagination to the promise of the modern tradition that such fantasies have come to represent. The fact is that we now inhabit an Earth whose profound geological disjunctures and increasingly catastrophic ecological dynamics evade and elude progressive grasp, attuning us not so much to an epic of redemption or a horizon of emancipation, but to a tragic appreciation of the inextricable connections that bind all too human histories to inhuman dynamics of chance, of contingency, of catastrophe that no plan can account for and no progressive historicity can gainsay. The questions that interest me then are these. What might it take to pose some of the questions and some of the ideas for which the future has stood? What might it take to put those questions otherwise on an Earth whose geohistorical disjunctures and catastrophic dynamics append the progressive historicity that once made the future a matter of hope and aspiration? What might it take, in other words, to live after progress, to appraise lives worth living outside its logic, or to borrow the words of the Buen Vivir movement, to envisage forms of living well that need not be founded on the perpetual promise of living better? I'll leave it there.
Thank you, Dominique, for the invitation to organize this event. Well, regarding the first question, I would say that my work particularly engaged with the notions of normal, abnormal, and social biological sciences divides. In fact, my research around the cerebral subject and the rise of the neurocultures engaged with both binomials. My interest in neurosciences and subjectivity led me to examine the emergence of the movement of neurodiversity as a way to challenge notions of normality and normality by redefining autism from pathology to difference, and the importance of the neurosciences in this process. I have examined the ways neuroscientific vocabulary is mobilized not to advance solipsistic, reductionist views of the person and sociality, as critics of neuroscience believe, but to create new forms of subjectivity and biosocialities, as the neurodiversity movement evinces. These forms of neurological subjectivities and biosocialities challenge a radical division between social and biological sciences. What we see is that notions such as cerebral subject or neurochemical self are not meant to suggest that a neurobiological perspective dictates views of subjectivity always and absolutely, but that in some times and contexts it effectively does. In real life, every day ontologies coexist, both inside a society and within a single individual. Accordingly, we pragmatically shift registers in our ways of acting, experiencing, and interacting, as well as thinking and speaking about ourselves and others. The claim to neurodiversity is connected to a naturalized identity, according to which I am who I am because my brain is wired in a certain way. For autistic self-advocates, neurologizing their condition helps to redefine it in terms of an organically localized difference. Neurodiversity advocates' engagement with the neurosciences has become a major vehicle for fashioning personal identities. Autistic identity politics draw neurological vocabulary to justify and naturalize differences between autistic and so-called neurotypicals, and in doing so, boosting polarized dichotomous rhetoric. Emphasizing commonality within the spectrum of autism constitutes an important political move that could counter the critiques of several parents and professional groups who accuse them of speaking in the name of all autistics. This process is far from straightforward, since autistic self-advocates must negotiate their neurocentric identity politics, a desire for significant forms of sociality, the brain as confining metaphor for some, or as liberating condition for others, and various ways of relating to medicine and to the neurotypical world, be coexistence or separation. However, when we move beyond that polarization, we begin to see nuances, chiaroscuros, and pragmatic negotiations and integration that challenge and transcend those divides and tensions. Rather than digging into the rhetoric of war and oppositions, it is more productive to investigate carefully the multiple ways different actors engage with autism according to the position from which they stand and the types of claims they seek to gain. In fact, neither all parents oppose self-advocacy movements, nor do all autistic adults favor the neurodiversity movement. Conversely, some self-advocates display a pragmatic attitude toward medical interventions that does not fit neatly within the neurodiversity paradigm. In addition, some autistic adults do want to be cured.
Thank you. This experiment is very interesting because I'm starting to see all sorts of connections, even though you work in such distinct areas. I just wanted to ask if anyone wanted to pick up on any of these threads before we move to the next question in terms of resonances you see. I mean, one of the things that comes to my mind is in each of your empirical domains, the imagination or the possibility of change is imagined in very different ways. And yet in some senses, whether it's in the psychiatric clinic, the neurosciences, ecological devastation, feminist politics, or psychosocial development in the context of trials, we're all grappling with what this otherwise might look like and what kinds of lessons we can learn from activists that are working in different domains perhaps thinking about life after progress, if not in those exact terms. But anyway, I just wanted to extend the invitation before we move on to the next question, if anyone wanted to pick up on a thread. Or we could move on to the next question. So the next question is related in the sense that we have asked you to give some thought to barriers to disciplinary specialization, whether within the social sciences or with the hard sciences, precisely because if we are thinking about theories and actions and forms of politics for a different kind of speculative imagination, perhaps one of the things that we do need is to speak across disciplines, not just across disciplines, but across different empirical areas of expertise. So that's what we have for me to reflect on for the next question.
Thanks, Dominic. Maybe just one point to make on that previous conversation is this concept of futurity, or the lack of futurity, seems to be a commonality you can pick up on. So overcoming disciplinary boundaries and fostering collaboration and exchange. As I said, I trained in medicine and anthropology, so I would say my entire career, or a lot of my energy, has been directed towards thinking about disciplinary silos and how we can break those down, or at least how we might broker conversations between silos. And I think the first thing to say is that fostering collaboration and exchange between disciplines with very different epistemologies and orientations is very hard work and requires an ethic of generosity and patience. And I would say an adherence to what Vincent Adams and colleagues, now already 10 years ago, called slow research. This is not necessarily research that is done slowly, but research that values quality, responsiveness, caution, and engagement. I think it's worthwhile to be very deliberate in how we decide on the kinds of projects that require interdisciplinary efforts versus those that are sometimes better attended to with a singular disciplinary lens. I appreciate the definition of anthropologist Anthony Stavrianakis, who has explicitly studied collaboration between scientists and social scientists. And in his ethnographic observations, he makes the point that a worthwhile collaboration is one in which two kinds of participants in their engagement can name a problem or do a practice that in their position as individuals, they would not have been able to do. So there's a presumption of transformation that's inherent in the idea of collaboration that he's pointing to. And I think that preface is really important because it ensures investment from all parties in collaborative work. So I thought I'd put forward a few strategies. The first, deliberate assessment of when interdisciplinary collaboration is the most useful or the only approach to a problem. Secondly, identifying brokers that can lead and facilitate those exchanges. And finally, valuing the different kinds of outputs that arise from such collaborations, keeping at the forefront the shared aims and values that drive that research. So in my own work and collaborations with scientists and clinicians who work in this field of developmental origins of health and disease, there are these commonalities. We are all interested in how we secure intergenerational health, how we understand the folding of social inequality into bodies, what it means to live well, which is something someone's already touched on, and how health interventions can aid this pursuit. So, finding those commonalities is, I guess, the initial way in which to broker what can be very difficult and uncomfortable collaborations, but nevertheless productive and I think useful.
I think one of the most utilized words tends to be interdisciplinarity, and I know, that's not something I'm going to use here. I think for me, one of the challenges around thinking about my role as a researcher, as an academic, is actually, and I've been coming to terms with this, is thinking about what the purpose of my work is, and it's also not completely capitulating to the neoliberal, university that we occupy, which I think in many ways is asking for us to do the kind of interdisciplinary work as a way of further perpetuating kind of the penetration of capitalism. And I think higher education institutions are so much at the center of that. So when we look at our disciplinary boundaries, I often see and find myself reflecting on literatures which are aiding and abetting the further penetration of capital. So I, for one, would identify that as an ongoing struggle I would see within the academy and across the disciplinary boundaries. So we oftentimes look at these disciplinary boundaries and think, how do we cross them? Do we want to work with each other? Why can't we work better across these silos? But if we pose the question differently, it may be that, in fact, we need to identify what the problem is. And I think kind of the pandemic has sort of meant a few times thinking about technology, we're still sort of thinking about these crises that we've sort of been through. But actually these crises, we have these debates around thinking about coloniality, that did we need Black Lives Matter in 2020 to tell us? How many more centuries of atrocities of racial violence did we need in order for there to be evidence? And so one of the boundaries I also see, even within development studies, which is a department I teach in, is the tensions between, and even the sort of international development, which cuts across sort of geography, politics, economics, is within that we might say we have the hard social sciences and the soft ones. We have anthropologists amongst the sociologists. Is those tensions across the kind of methods that we use, the epistemologies that we sort of draw upon or claim to represent, is what evidence looks like. And I think sometimes those silos can be overemphasized. Sometimes we can also play with them. We're very clever as academics. We spend so much time studying, like, what do we do with these frameworks? So for me, in many ways, the challenge is ongoing. I think students are often asking us we do forums at the end of the year. And so in many ways, they're kind of activists within our, in the midst of these institutions that we're trying to keep afloat. We are employees of them. We have students who are paying fees. The entire context we're in terms of knowledge production is tied to that system. Where do we begin to learn, and where, and I think the learning, and that's the next question, begins with this kind of epistemic humility, first of all, learning from the world that we're supposedly analyzing and theorizing about, understanding change, thinking about the futures, the potentials, but actually it's all speculation, because most of it is actually thinking about what our role is at this moment in time. What is the point of this work that we're doing? And I think if we can work across that, I think those partnerships are there. But we often have to look for funding, and I think the funding of research is often tied to government policy frameworks. And I think that's the challenge for many of us as researchers, is thinking, how do we cleverly craft an application or a research project that is somehow aligned to an agenda that is tied to the system. And in other ways, we're trying to find a little niche that's yet to be explored to show that this is a unique area of research. And in between all of that, I actually do retain the kind of belief that we can do innovative work, but it doesn't necessarily have to be owned by the academy. I think there's still spaces to be an activist in the world while also doing academic work. And for me, I think crossing those silos and those boundaries is about existing as a producer of knowledge, as a consumer of knowledge, someone who is also perpetuating knowledge, but also recognizing that we exist within the system which we have inherited, we are also passing on, but we also can create ruptures, we can also disrupt, we can also dismantle. And the frameworks that I see around, so I'm speaking from development studies, which I think exists across, it's a very interdisciplinary discipline in itself, is actually the challenges we have to the disruption, to trying to challenge frameworks, how sedimented some of those frameworks actually become and how difficult those challenges are.
Thank you. Yeah, I think I couldn't agree more with both of you. In a way, I've got two answers to this question, none of which are very helpful, I should say. But one is more upbeat than the other, and in a way, there are kind of a blend of your two previous answers. I mean, the first thing I would say, and I think what both of my answers would share, although for very different reasons, is the sense that the problem of interdisciplinary collaboration and exchange, as we tend to call it, poses itself, in my view, very differently depending on the constellation of practices and disciplines and practitioners we are contemplating. The traffic, in my experience, between the humanities and the social sciences, even the little margins of psychology that would like to think of themselves as belonging to both, remains relatively, I want to say relatively unproblematic, despite the very different registers on which these various modalities of knowledge making can and do articulate their concerns, methodologies, questions, epistemologies, and so on. And in this sense, I think the creation of post-disciplinary fields like post-colonial studies, queer studies, Black studies, environmental humanities, science studies, and so on, are, in my view, very welcome inventions, however long these fields last. Not because they do away with disciplinary borders, but because they elaborate spaces of exchange and collaboration that make it perceptible that what makes us think is an encounter with the world that, by definition, overwhelms the grooves of specialization. So when it comes to interdisciplinary collaborations between the humanities and the social sciences on the one hand, and the biological and the natural sciences more generally, in my view, the problem changes, right? It looks very different. Now, I'd like to be able to say that although the landscape of modern knowledge has led precisely to this over-specialization that you mentioned and that Whitehead once beautifully called minds in a groove, collaboration remains theoretically possible as a function of learning to pose the right questions, to pose problems well, as Michelle was alluding to. That is, in ways that can simultaneously gather a heterogeneous collective of diverse practitioners whilst enabling them to situate their own interests, the sense of what matters to their practices, also the requirements that each of their practices makes and demands of the worlds they study, and the divergent ways in which they consent to being obligated by this world. Here, it'd be remiss of me not to recall some of the work that I've done on speculation for many years. And I'd be remiss not to make a case for the development of speculative approaches that might lure a variety of practices to meet one another in the realm of the possible, right? Inviting them to work together, not by attempting to shock and awaiting one another to a reality from which they would have been blinkered somehow, but by producing, as it were, shared fictions that respect the importance of what gives other practices and disciplines a hold, whilst affirming that the other's dreams and ideas, just like ours, are created according to the means of their own adventures. Now, that's my more upbeat answer. A more downbeat answer, however, would begin by noting that this very good and hopeful question about the possibility of fostering such collaborations is almost always posed by humanities and social science scholars, and by them alone. You may contradict me, and you're welcome to do so, but I have almost never heard scientists ask these questions, whereas we are asking them all the time. In my experience, the latter, the scientists, usually have actually not that much interest in such possibilities unless they happen to be on their own terms. More importantly, they also seem to have somewhat limited need for them, whilst we are filling our mouths with interdisciplinarity in every grant application and job application. Which is to say that perhaps it is not only a question of over-specialization and the creation of silos, perhaps it is just plain and simply a question of power. Right? Not, mind you, the power of scientists themselves, either individually or as a group, but rather the power of science as the epistemic arm of the state. Right? The faith and ongoing investment it places in its promise to deliver progress against all odds. It of course only takes an off-the-record conversation with a climate scientist, a cosmological physicist, or even a neuroscientist, and I know a bit about that, not because I work on this like you, but because my partner is one, to learn that they too are skeptical of what their sciences can actually achieve, suspicious of the very promises they nevertheless make to get their grants, and not always hopeful about finding the answers they seek. One of my PhD students recently completed a thesis studying cosmological physicists, in which all they seem to express is a profound sense of anxiety that their entire generations of work might have been completely in vain, because actually nothing makes any sense to them anymore. And yet, it is the promise of progress that makes the scientific enterprise what it is today, what it has been since the 19th century, which is why I frankly doubt to what extent they can be enlisted scientists, that is, in a collaborative unsettling of progress without precipitating a profound revaluation of their practices, a resignification of their authority, a challenge to their systems of funding, as well as a transformation of their modes of sense-making. So yeah, that's my more pessimistic take. Sorry for that. As I said, I'm very happy to be, I hope I'm wrong, I'm very happy to be persuaded otherwise.
Thank you. Well, hearing you talking, I think that I mean, as many of you here that are with a more multidisciplinary, interdisciplinary background, I always also work across silos and across disciplinary boundaries. I was trained as a philosopher in Spain and in Germany. Then I worked 25 years in Brazil in the fields of collective health and public health. Now I am back in Spain and I'm working at Center of Medical Anthropology. So I always had this issue, and I always contest disciplinary boundaries and say, okay, this is the field of the sociologists. You are not supposed to read that. There's nothing about that, and this is anthropology. So I really never worried much about that. And the work I've been doing also for almost a decade on neurosciences and neurocultures has been also to contest those boundaries in fields like, for instance, cultural neuroscience or neuroethics, or all the fields where there is supposed to be a collaboration between the social and the humanities and the natural sciences. And I do agree here with Martin that my experience working with scientists has been also very tricky, because they agree to be in a workshop where you discuss those issues, but I mean, at the end, they're only interested in technical issues. I remember a conference on neuroaesthetics, and so where the neuroscientists they only ask very technical questions about the resolution on the MRI machine that you use, and things. So there's not. And also what we see is that beyond these discourses on biodisciplinarity and between a balance between the culture and the brain, what we see at the end is that there is a hierarchy where the brain is always at the top, and cultural it also modulates this brain process. I mean, some colleagues disagree and talk about, and also sympathetic of this idea of critical friendship with neurosciences, as people like Nick Rose, Des Fitzgerald, and so on speak. But also one thing that I was thinking when talk about this question, and I also talked with Dominique about it. This is also the work that Dominique and I have been doing in Brazil with COVID. After COVID, with mutual aid groups and social solidarity networks that really think that the challenge very models of societal development and challenge the basic work that fields like global health, conduct, etc. That's been very interesting. There's also another boundary that is also displaced, the boundary between academia and activism and etc. That is also a very important boundary, because what we saw in our work in Brazil is that basic assumptions of global health, for for instance, the idea that interventions has to be vertical, target interventions, with minimal training, that feasible, delivered by community actors, that they're very challenged, because activists that we interview and that we saw, they are engaged in forms of governance that are at the same time both short, targeted, and broader actions that really aim at building infrastructure and tackle multiple determinants of health, from economic livelihood, food security, to mental health and police repression. That is also interesting. Also, what we see is that there is not a competition between intervention that we see also in global health, but that those activists, they create a very interesting network with intricate mechanisms for redistribution of resources, coupled with meaningful relations built over time, and widespread informed critique about the political and economic structure that cause harms. And these different structures have been mobilized for a very long time, because this, what we saw is that those people, when we interviewed them and asked them about the pandemic, they didn't talk about the pandemic. They just say something about the pandemic. They say, well, the pandemic, is something, we have pandemics all the time, problems, continuous law problems, from minor floods to police brutality and etc. That is something very, very interesting. Also, another thing that they do is that they put politics in the center of the interventions. From a global health with intends to be politically neutral and objective. Those people really compress technocratic approaches and favor more political engagement. Also, they contest the very same idea of what it means implementation in the community. So what we saw is that this activism that we see in our fieldwork and in our interviews, they underscore the multiple and less visible pathways to social change that move beyond merely complementing existing public health structures and seek to redistribute power in ways that create more health-enabled social environments. Effective local public health governance is more than a technical and managerial issue. It involves strategies for countering chronic marginalization and disempowerment of historically subjugated populations.
Thank you. I think that's a nice example to feed into our last question, which is, what do you think we can learn from emerging concepts, initiatives, frameworks, whatever you'd like to call it, in post-anti-development, degrowth, decoloniality, unlearning, other concepts that you might want to share?
So I read that list you gave us, and I find the concept of unlearning especially compelling. I think also, given its salience to this conversation we've just had about interdisciplinary collaboration, or the lack thereof, the collaborative generosity required when you do engage in that work. I'm particularly drawn to the work of Ariella Aisha Azule on this concept. In her book, Potential History, Unlearning Imperialism, she describes unlearning as, quote, a process of disengaging from the unquestioning use of political concepts, institutions such as citizen, archive, art, sovereignty, human rights, as well as the categories like the new, the neutral, all of which fuel the intrinsic imperial drive to progress, close quote. And I think there's immense value in emphasizing how newness and novelty and neutrality are privileged in place of history and context in the way that research infrastructures and knowledge production is organized. And I think we've already been pointing to that quite a lot in our discussion so far. My own work has been very much focused on the politics of attention, what is foregrounded, what is backgrounded in a seemingly neutral fashion, for example, when it comes to the politics of reproduction. So how, for example, might we unlearn the assumptions that the reproductive body is female, heterosexual, a form of property available for intervention? These neutral assumptions have driven a continued renewal of interest in top-down interventions on women's bodies, with colonial developments and now global health interventions, following old, well-trodden paths of intervention to improve maternal education in groups deemed vulnerable and in need of intervention. And there are, of course, important commonalities between that unlearning framework and a decolonial lens as a means to interrupt assumptions of global orders and their attendant effects on gender and race relations. Now, Dominique also asked us about the challenges of such initiatives. And I think some of the challenges, of course, are that ideas that seem at once radical are transformed when they are subsumed into institutions as part of our efforts towards progress. We've been talking about the neoliberal university already. And these ideas are themselves not always immune to the problem of a lack of historicity in terms of accounting for methods and forms of resistance that precede more recent calls for radical action. So, of course, I'm from South Africa, so I think a little bit about that context. And as Achille Mbembe noted in his comments on decolonizing the university in the wake of the Rhodes Must Fall movement, he said that the object of the decolonial project is, quote, a complex and mutating entity. And he asked the question in 2016, is today's beast the same as yesterday's, or are we confronting an entirely different apparatus, an entirely different rationality, both of which require us to produce radical new concepts? And I'll rely on him again for the second challenge, I think, of some of these initiatives that he's described very clearly for some time now. And that is the notion that any of these imaginations work when the organizing principle remains the nation state. But to end with a return to my own work, and more specifically my positionality as a South African scholar who moves between the UK and South Africa, I think one of the real challenges of these frameworks is that they force us to assess our own culpability in perpetuating particular structures and hierarchies, and to what extent we can unlearn the conventions that condition our role in the academy. I think that follows on from what we've been discussing.
Interesting. I'm going back to development, and I know in the title of this event it's development, and in many ways, the ways in which I approach development is largely that it is in this moment in time, and the history of the idea of development as some kind of move towards progress, towards certain goals, but of course steeped in this history of colonization and coloniality, is this idea that really development is capitalism. And so what I want to do, if we just set that aside as my understanding of it, that the ways in which we are now beginning, and I think I sort of began in the first question by referring to the context of Gaza, is thinking about what, if we're thinking about these frameworks, why don't we think about, rather than just a D, whether it's degrowth, de-development, what does that mean actually to reverse or to disrupt or to dismantle? What it means is largely to argue that in the university, we oftentimes, when we're doing our research, are removed from the violence that exists on the street level, that is being mass produced by corporations, by the state, by the military. And I think in many ways to ask questions around what role the state is playing, and I think I'll go back to my beginning point around the carceral futures and my work on anti-carceral feminism, is by identifying the ways in which feminists have for the last few decades contributed to carceral capitalism. They've contributed to it by arguing that we need a stronger state to punish gender-based violence perpetration. So that's on the one hand happening. On the other hand, the state and the influence of capital in shaping the priorities of the state, in the shaping of it, have also, this is happening globally. So dehumanization that we see is part of the de-development project, in my view. And what that means is by recognizing that some people's lives are not viewed as being as worthy or even worthy of existence. And we see this in the Indian context. We've seen in 2019 the abrogation of the special status of Kashmir. And this relates actually to global public health in the sense my research on population, we're looking at population in a much more societal level. We're looking at the level of the kind of biopolitics that while on the one hand, the special status of a particular region after its independence from formal colonization, the coloniality that we see within what we'll say is a settler colonial context in the South Asian context, the dehumanization that took place with pellet guns being used, which had grave health implications, was being simultaneously done while development was being projected. And there were large-scale schemes that were launched at that point with large corporations such as the Adani and the Ambani, who were very much behind the rise of the current regime, and similar ways in which seeing the context of Palestine. So I think we actually have to name these in oftentimes less theoretical ways. And so I think using terminologies like violence and dehumanization alongside coloniality and decolonization, which of course have been absorbed by institutions, I think there's a lot of pushback we're seeing as well. So while I see the value of these terminologies and the importance, I'm also a little skeptical around adopting them as the new buzzwords. Because very quickly, as we've seen, and I mentioned the example of Black Lives Matter, we saw how institutions and the solidarity statements and the ways in which, the academy, all of the frameworks had to suddenly become introspective for a few months, for the next couple of years. And already we see a return to some kind of normality or a reshaping or a rejigging of the frameworks in ways which have kind of moved on already, that we've already been there. And I think the importance of not forgetting the frameworks, where they come from. So, I mean, my own work is engaged with coloniality in terms of feminist politics. It's a constant project of digging, of reflecting. I mean, there's an archaeology of knowledge around feminist knowledge production, which has been part and parcel of coloniality, but it's also about thinking across those frameworks. So I think we all have to be kind of responsible and accountable to the frameworks that our disciplines are utilizing, but also the ones that we cite in our articles and our publications. Are we actually true to those politics? Are we kind of reproducing them for the sake of doing that? Can we do academic, intellectual work that isn't necessarily tied to the project of ongoing coloniality? Can we think about de-development as a process of violence, of state violence and capitalist violence? And what then, therefore, can we represent in terms of our work? These, I think, are very hard questions. I think the encampments that we see, I've just walked over from SOAS, are asking us to respond, to think about what does it mean to ask for boycotts, to divest. It means to demand from the state and capital to address these issues of grave dehumanization that are taking place. So not only in one context, but how they're joined up. And I think the joining up is the work that I see as the challenge for us as academics, as researchers, as students, to be able to understand and develop new frameworks that are even more responsible to the people and the societies that we are theorizing about and trying to understand the processes that are shaping them.
Thank you. That was really well put. I'm not sure what I can follow that with, and obviously this question is impossible to answer in 3 minutes or so. But I just want to make, I think, two small points. I mean, my sense is that one of the things that one can learn from, let's call them very broadly conceived decolonial movements, that is from an entire kind of global tapestry of ongoing alternative projects, in my case, in socio-ecological adaptation, transformation, forms of social improvisation, it's precisely a kind of rich and complex history of what it means to eke a life on the margins of the modern world, you know, on the sort of dull edges of its promises, sort of under the thumb of its project, and therefore some intimation of what kind of a non-progressive imagination might look like. You know, in a way, you know, for me, the question of living after progress is not at all purely or primarily a theoretical one, certainly not one that can or should be answered in the abstract or in abeyance of that multiplicity of histories, of practices, of trajectories that make the question possible in the first place by virtue simply of having undertaken it in practice. And in this sense, you know, I'm very interested, for instance, in the history of marronage in the Americas, in any number of contemporary practices and projects in autonomous climate adaptation, food democracy, the commoning of health, by which people attempt to navigate uneven regimes of toxicity and environmental vulnerability, to learn how to live and die well by implicating their bodies into other configurations between peoples and plants and so on. So in a way, I mean, to put it simply, to the question of what can we learn, I would say to think. You know, we can learn to think by paying attention to them. At the same time, you know, we probably shouldn't forget that, you know, when it comes to the question of progress, the decolonization struggles of the mid-20th century never really managed to contest or even wanted to contest or displace the imperative of progress. And instead, sort of the march of progress carried on in the promise of national sovereignty, of multiple modernities, in the form of a world system of post-colonial dependency and counterinsurgency that, under the aegis of humanitarian aid and the promotion of freedom and rights and so on, established development, right? Technocratic strategies and programs to modernize and bring about economic prosperity and social progress and so on for the so-called third world. And in so doing, progressively incorporating ever more remote communities into the grasp of the world capitalist economy, whilst turning every corner of the earth into an extractive resource. So this is the sense, I think, in which the imperative of progress can and does often underpin even critiques of growth. You know, when I earlier said that for me, progress is not just one value amongst others, it is sort of the perspective from which we value the value of, from which modernity values the value of growth, of betterment, of technological innovation and so on. Because there is progress even in critiques of growth, of development, even in critiques of colonialism, we find this sort of progressive gesture. And so in that sense, insofar as progress is a perspective of valuation, one can change the values without changing the perspective that gives those values their value. We're still, therefore, in the hold of progress when, for instance, the horizon no longer is economic growth, but ecological reflexivity, when it's no longer development, but sustainability, et cetera, et cetera. So there's also, for me, the question of what thinking after progress can teach us about how to read and what to value about those historical and contemporary experiments and methodologies of life. When these do not offer a cure, when one cannot discern in them the path to a wholly new and better common world to come, or the prospect of some kind of future in which the precarity of planetary habitation would have been sort of relegated yet again to a bygone past. So, in a way, one of the things that interests me about the various histories and case studies that I work with is precisely that these experiments do not prescribe lessons on the good life, as it were. They do not give us some other wonderful, environmentally friendly and, land revering way of inhabiting the earth, some kind of which we kind of praise by contrast to everything we ascribe to the modern world and so on. They're interesting to me because all they do is affirm the radical instability of any life worth living, right? The fleeting character by which we can, at which at any point we can say, yes, I am really living it. So, decolonization, as Fanon famously did, in what is perhaps my favorite formulation by him of this, is a program for complete disorder that seeks to overturn this world's order. And so when the task is to overturn the world and not just to reproduce it, I reckon a close attention to such movements, practices, and experiments also demands an elaboration of other vocabularies, perhaps not the ones, and this is perhaps something we can come back to. I'm sympathetic to the argument that says, to your suggestion, I think you're completely right. Of course, I mean, I wonder who would push back against the idea that, the moment Kings or Goldsmiths or Sowers, SMT starts talking about decolonization, we've lost that word to them. But as we see currently in relation to Gaza, even with the concept of genocide and the way in which it is subject to the most perverse contortions and sort of legal, semantic, semiotic revisions, I am not sure that a strategy of seemingly less theoretical words does it, because all words seem to be equally liable to being captured. But I am interested and do think that if there's anything, one of the things we can do is to keep elaborating vocabularies, because it is also with new words, however short-lived they turn out to be until they're turned against us, that other ways of valuing the world become imaginable. Yeah, I'll stop there.
So thank you. I think we're running out of time, so we try to be quickly, and I'm gonna take a case for the work I've been doing, more recent work on pragmatic negotiations of diagnostic categories and reparative approaches in mental health care in Brazil, because I think they help to unsettle many of those concepts and binomials and maybe to alternatives. So, and I will pick two examples, one, the ADHD controversies and also autism controversies in Brazil. So talking first about attention deficit disorder controversies in Brazil oppose two views, two sort of discourses, two autonomous views, biomedical and we can call them medicalization discourses. The former is advanced by patients, professionals, organizations, as well as the Psychiatrists Association in Brazil. They argue that ADHD is underdiagnosed and undertreated. And the critique to this view is championed mainly by mental health, collective health, education and social science academics and professionals who are cautious about the over-medicalization. Attention, but what I think is the attention to local uses and practices through reparative ethnographies helps to overcome dichotomies opposed biomedical and medicalization discourses. When we take a closer look, we see an unequal distribution of medication in the country according to social class and access to resources. Huge dispensation in private healthcare and lack of access in public system. So both poles in the discussions are partly right over the medicalization of middle and upper classes, a lack of access to medication along with other forms of health and social care for vulnerable populations. I think that reparative ethnographies evince that in context of extreme poverty and structural vulnerabilities, pharmaceutical interventions for learning and attention difficulties are not favored. And in the case, and very quickly, in the case of autism in Brazil, there is a battle over the category at the level of public mental health discourses and policies, opposing also two understandings and dichotomous views of autism be as mental suffering or disability. Mental health care in the country oppose the creation of specialized services for different diagnoses. And on the other hand, Parents Association champions autism as disability associated with diagnosis, specific services, and evidence-based treatments. What is interesting is that these antagonistic understandings hamper serious discussions and cooperations between mental health professionals and parent associations. What is worse, it divides already scarce resources which are designated for the same public between two different networks, mental health and disability, with almost no intervention. Of course, not all parents associations in Brazil are against community mental health care centers. What is more important, despite the discourses against diagnosis and specific services, those services pragmatically gather children together with practical purposes, which regularly lead to diagnostically homogeneous groups and activities. Parents in Brazil also display a pragmatic attitude when they adopt specialized services or embrace both types of services in context of extreme social vulnerability. Parents don't seem to worry much about whether autism is a mental disorder, a neurobiological disease, or an intellectual disability. Etiologic conceptions and public health services are mobilized according to their specific ends. The acceptance of labels with pragmatic ends does not involve any epistemological or ontological commitment to the true nature of the condition. Regarding ADHD and autism in Brazil, when we move beyond the dichotomies and polarizations through reparative, historical, and ethnographic research around the local, everyday practices and experiences of practitioners, users, families, and associations, we see that those binaries, apparently solid and entrenched, are not so definite. What we find instead is a pragmatic and reparative attitude toward diagnostic entities, ideological positions, ontological commitments, organization of services, and everyday practice of healthcare providers that are reconfigured, challenged, integrated, and negotiated by medical and non-medical actors within and outside healthcare services. Thank you.